They never told their children, never spoke of it aloud, not once in all their years together, but every night, as the fire dimmed and the house fell quiet, they lay beside each other, not touching, not speaking, just listening. Listening for the right moment, the tiny gap in the rhythm of sleep and breath, the chance, because in a single room home where 7 people shared a bed, intimacy was a secret war, not of lust, but of patience. Timing and silence, imagine it. You're 26, your husband lies beside you, but on the other side your mother, beside her your younger brother. Your baby sleeps near your feet, swaddled against the cold. Above you on a creaking loft your father snores heavily. There are no doors to close, no curtains to draw, and no such thing as privacy. Still, your body does not forget it is alive. You turn slightly, carefully. Too much sound and the floor groans, too fast and the baby stirs, but you shift just enough that your knee brushes against his leg. You wait. A moment later he breathes in, not deep, not loud, but you know it's for you. A signal, yes, I'm awake, and now it begins. What little can begin. He reaches beneath the blanket and takes your hand. You let your fingers fold into his. That's all it is, a touch, a pulse of warmth. But in a world that denies you even that, it is everything. There are no kisses, no passionate embraces, not here, not tonight. Tonight, there is only presence, a shared moment beneath the weight of generations and that single thin blanket passed down from your grandmother's wedding trunk. The walls creak, a cough, a dog barking far off in the night, and then a whisper tomorrow. He murmurs, barely audible, his lips not moving. You nod, though he cannot see it. You know what he means. The barn, late morning, you'll say you're checking on the goats. He'll come later, that's the plan, if no one's watching, if the children stay quiet, if her mother doesn't decide to follow. The danger is not in being caught unclothed, but in being seen wanting. Desire is not private here, it's scandal, it's shame. The church says even married touch is to be controlled, measured, kept behind the veil of procreation. Anything else is sin, so you pretend, every day you pretend. You are modest, you are silent, you are obedient, but your heart, your body, they whisper like wind through the cracks in the wall. You close your eyes, the baby shifts, your mother sighs, someone turns in their sleep. And still, your hand rests in his. You remember when you first met, when your hands touched in the bread line after a feast day. He passed you a slice of barley loaf and let his thumb rest too long on your wrist. You blushed so fiercely you feared your face would burn off. Now, years later, that same thumb brushes yours beneath a shared blanket, and you feel 20 again. You feel seen, real. Not just a daughter, not just a mother, not just another pair of hands to mend the wool and milk the cow, but a woman, his woman. The fire cracks once, then silence. You release his hand slowly, carefully. The moment is over. Tomorrow will come. The barn will wait, and with it, maybe, just maybe, 1 hour that belongs to no one else. Until then, you wait and pretend to sleep, knowing he's doing the same. 2 lovers, side by side, touching the edge of a world that will never understand them. Morning comes not with light, but with sound, the clatter of pails, the lowing of hungry cattle, the rhythmic pounding of kneaded dough. Life begins before the sun lifts her head, and with her rise the expectations of everyone else. There is no room for romance here, no morning kisses, no whispered goodbyes beneath a doorway, only duty. Chores, eyes everywhere. The world they live in is not built for tenderness. It is built for survival. The year is 1378. Somewhere in rural England, in the aftershock of plague and famine, life is returning, but slowly. The village is small, tucked between wild forest and tilled fields. Its people are devout, tired, and suspicious of pleasure. Most of them believe hardship is holy, that suffering pleases God, and within this belief system, the human body is a battleground. Especially for women. The church teaches that even within marriage, intimacy is not for joy. It is for function, to make children. Anything more is indulgence, and indulgence leads to damnation. A husband who touches his wife with too much longing. A wife who welcomes his touch too eagerly. Sinful, shameful, unnatural. So husbands and wives learn to be discreet. They invent codes, silent languages of glances and gestures. They become actors on the stage of daily life, their most private feelings hidden behind the mask of routine. She never says, "I want you." She says, "The chickens are restless today." He never replies, "I need you." He says, "I'll check the coop after supper." But they both understand what's being said. In households like theirs, it's not unusual for 10 or more people to sleep in one room. Not just family, but visiting cousins, laborers, widowed aunts, the occasional traveling priest. Space is shared, food is rationed, even silence is communal, and when the sun goes down, the entire family returns to the single room that holds their lives. The hearth glows low. The children settle into piles of straw and old wool. The elders mumble prayers. The wind whistles through the thatch, and somewhere in that cramped hush, two people try to hold on to something the world keeps trying to take away. Love, not the grand kind, not the love of songs or stories, but the quiet, persistent love that refuses to vanish. Seasons shape their chances. Winter is the worst. Cold seeps into bones and makes undressing dangerous. Every breath becomes a cloud. The nights are long, but the opportunities are few. Every creak is a betrayal. Every cough could be a witness. Spring, though, it brings hope. The days grow longer, the fields call. And so do the barns, the forests, the riversides. With more work comes more freedom. Time alone becomes possible again, if only briefly, but even then eyes are everywhere, a sister who notices a missing scarf, a neighbor who sees two shadows moving behind the barley, a priest who preaches about Eve's temptations with sudden fire in his voice. Every action must be calculated, every meeting timed, and every desire buried beneath layers of shame. They adapt, they survive, they find joy in the smallest of things, a shared cup of broth, a moment alone in the woodshed, the brief flicker of fingers brushing under a heavy cloak. And through it all, they carry their secret like a fragile ember in the wind. Because to be caught is not just to be shamed, it is to be punished, to lose reputation, position, possibly even life. So they do what lovers always have in times of silence and control. They wait, they watch. They whisper, and in that unyielding world of watchful eyes, they learn how to make even a stolen glance feel like a rebellion. It was a late spring morning when everything began to change. The sky was pale and wide, the air soft with the scent of wet earth and blooming nettles. The fields glistened under a faint mist, and the world, just for a moment, felt like it had exhaled after a long winter's breath. She was in the garden, pulling weeds with frozen fingers, her apron damp from the morning dew. Her eyes kept drifting to the edge of the woods, where the trees curled like crooked fingers just beyond the barley fields. He walked past her without a word, but as he passed, his hand brushed hers. Not by accident. She stood slowly, heart pounding harder than it should. She wiped her hands, even though they weren't dirty, and after glancing toward the cottage, where her mother hummed inside and her siblings argued near the water barrel, she followed. It wasn't planned, not exactly, but it had been building for days. The signs had been subtle, a longer glance during supper, the way he shifted on the straw mattress at night, inching just slightly closer. The way she had taken her time hanging the linens, hoping he might wander by the wash line. The barn was quiet when she stepped inside. Dust hung in the sunbeams, and the cows were still tethered, chewing with that slow, eternal rhythm of creatures who never hurry. He was there already waiting. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The silence was thick, charged. She stepped closer. He took her hand, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, they were alone. Not just alone in body, but alone from judgment, from the unblinking eyes of tradition and obligation, from the expectations of her mother, the sermons of the priest, the ever-growing needs of the children. For once, they were simply man and woman. There was no rush, no frantic fumbling, no desperate grasp for release. It was slower than that, tender even in its urgency. Every movement had meaning, every breath a promise. They didn't think about the risk, not then, not when their foreheads pressed together in the hay, not when she closed her eyes and forgot, for a brief and stolen moment, that the world outside would never understand this softness. It wasn't about lust, it wasn't about rebellion, it was about remembering that before they were parents they were lovers, before the chores, the prayers, the watchful glares, there had been this fragile, aching intimacy, a connection that had survived years of silence, of shared beds with no privacy, of whispered longing under wool blankets while others breathed inches away. But the world doesn't let moments like these go unnoticed for long. A crow called outside the barn, loud and sharp. She pulled away first, adjusted her skirt, smoothed her hair. He stepped back, already glancing toward the open door. They knew they had lingered too long. By the time she returned to the cottage, her mother was standing at the threshold. Her face unreadable, her arms crossed. The baby wailed in the background. A pot boiled over the hearth. No questions were asked. But something had shifted. That night as they lay in bed, her mother now between them, there was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with weather. Still, under the blanket, their fingers found each other once more. Just barely, just enough, because once the door to that hidden world had been opened, it could not be closed again. They had touched something sacred. Dangerous, yes, but sacred. Something more powerful than the church's rules, than the village whispers, than even the fear of being seen. They had remembered what it meant to be themselves, and that memory would not let them go. The whispers came slowly at first, like frost creeping across the edge of a window pane. It began with a neighbor's sideways glance. Then a cousin, visiting from 2 villages over, made an offhand comment at supper. "Strange how often she checks the goats these days, eh?" The room fell silent. Her mother's hand paused mid-stitch. From that moment on, everything changed. She could feel the air thicken around her like damp wool. When she entered a room, voices lowered. When she walked to the river to wash clothes, the other women turned their backs. At church, the priest's sermon grew more pointed, his voice rising with fervor as he warned of temptation, of Eve, of wives who forget their modesty and bring shame upon their households. She sat still in the pew, head bowed. Her husband beside her said nothing, but his jaw was clenched, and his hand never left his lap. They had been careful, so careful, and yet, in a village that prized silence and obedience above all else, even the hint of desire was a provocation. One night her mother spoke. "You are not a girl anymore," she said, her voice brittle with disappointment. "You have children to think of, reputation to protect. Do not bring shame on this house." She didn't argue. She couldn't. There were no words she could say that would not be used against her. So she smiled, she nodded, and she kept her distance. Days passed, then weeks. She avoided the barn, she avoided him. He understood, but not without pain. They returned to routine, to the rhythm of harvest and washing, of mending boots and tending wounds, but something vital had gone missing. At night, they still lay inches apart. But the silence was heavier now, not protective but punishing, and then came the midsummer fair, a rare escape, music, trade, color. Laughter filled the village for the first time in months. Her children danced in the grass. Her husband bartered for oats, and for a few hours life felt normal again. They met at the edge of the woods near dusk. Neither had planned it. She was gathering herbs, he was checking a fence post. But when their eyes met through the thinning light, the ache between them returned so suddenly it was like a wound reopening. He stepped forward first. She hesitated, just long enough to remember the risk. And then she moved. Behind the trees the world fell away. There was no village, no mother, no priest, no shame, only 2 people holding on to the only part of themselves the world could not take. But when they returned, minutes later, breathless and flushed, they knew. A woman had seen them, not clearly, perhaps, just a glimpse, a shape in the trees, a shadow too close, too familiar. It didn't matter. In a place like this, even shadows spoke. The next morning, the priest came to the house. His voice was calm, but his words were sharp. He asked her to pray, to confess. He reminded her of her duties, as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter of God. She nodded, hands folded, face downcast. She said all the right things. But inside, something had hardened. She was tired of pretending that love was a sin, tired of shrinking herself to fit a world that had no place for joy without guilt. That night, she did not wait for sleep to find her. She turned to her husband under the blanket and pressed her lips to his. Without fear, without secrecy, without apology. It wasn't defiance. It was a declaration. They had given their lives to this village, to its rules, to its silence, but this was theirs, and they would not give it up again. Years passed. The children grew, the cottage aged. New planks were nailed to old beams. Straw was replaced with stone, and a second room was finally added. Though by then, the intimacy that once had to be stolen now seemed almost too quiet, too allowed. Her hair turned silver at the temples. His back curved from years in the fields. They no longer crept out to barns or into woods. Their bodies didn't move with urgency anymore. But still, some nights, when the fire burned low and the wind tapped gently at the shutters, their fingers found each other beneath the blankets, low, warm, and familiar. They never spoke of the barn, or the forest, or that midsummer evening when everything could have shattered, but they remembered, not in words but in silence, in glances across a crowded table, in the way he cut her bread without being asked, in the way she knew when he needed warmth, even before he said a word. In time, the whispers faded. The priest who once stared so harshly from the pulpit passed away. New families moved into the village. Young couples began to court in secret, as they always had, and though nothing in the laws changed, something in the tone did. The fire didn't burn as hot. The judgment softened to something more tired, less cruel. But she never forgot what it had cost. She had lived a life in the shadows of others' expectations, had loved her husband like a fugitive, had hidden tenderness as though it were contraband, and she often wondered, why? Why must love apologize for itself? One evening, when her daughter, now grown, sat sewing by the hearth, she asked an innocent question. "Mother, how did you and father ever find time for yourselves, with all of us underfoot?" For a moment, the old woman said nothing. Her hands stilled in her lap, the fire crackled beside her, as if urging her to speak. Then she smiled, just a little. "We found time," she said, "where no one thought to look." And that was all she said. But in her daughter's eyes she saw the understanding bloom, just a flicker, because now she had a husband, a small home, a child of her own, and already she had begun to understand what her mother once endured, what every woman in that village line had silently borne. They weren't rebels, they weren't saints, they were simply people, trying to carve out a life inside the narrow walls they'd been given, trying to love without punishment, to feel without fear. And that memory, passed down not through stories but through the quiet resilience of gesture, became something unspoken and sacred, a legacy. Long after both she and her husband were buried beneath the oak tree at the edge of the village, the cottage stood, though smaller than it seemed in memory. Children played in the yard, the hearth still burned on cold nights, and sometimes, just sometimes, two lovers would slip away from the noise, into the woods, into the barn, into the fields at dusk, not because they had to, but because they could. They moved like shadows once did, careful but free, unapologetic, not knowing who came before them, not knowing how much had been risked, not knowing that in their every quiet kiss, every urgent touch stolen between moments of labor and watchfulness, they were living out a history deeper than bloodlines. They were carrying forward the ember that never died. The ember once lit in silence, once hidden beneath wool blankets and wooden beams, and now glowing softly in the hearts of those who would never have to hide again.